and welcome to this week's episode of Truffle Talks. I'm James Stephen, the editor of Truffle Report, and Truffle Talks is our weekly interview series where we sit down with the movers and shakers defining psychedelic business, policy reform, science, and culture. Our guest today is Chris Koddermann, public affairs consultant, as well as co-founder and chair of the International Therapeutic Psilocybin Rescheduling Initiative. And I think henceforth I'll just be saying the ITPRI or simply the initiative because it's a lot to get out at once. Chris, it's a pleasure to have you here.
Yeah, pleasure to be here. You can just say ITPRI. ITPRI works.
ITPRI? Okay, yes, great.
It's a little simpler than all the letters.
All right, thank you. So before we talk about ITPRI and this frankly Herculean task you set yourself to of reforming international drug law, how about a bit of background on you, your consultancy, and how you came to be interested in psilocybin reform?
Sure. I'm a Canadian, but have been based in Switzerland for the last 10 years. I'm a lawyer by training, but decided I didn't want to spend my life in the legal profession. So spent the early part of my career working in Canadian politics as an advisor to various federal and provincial cabinet ministers of several Liberal governments. And then spent some time in the corporate sector, in various corporate affairs, communications, government affairs roles. And about 3 years ago, set up my own public affairs consultancy where I have a significant focus on Geneva-based UN permanent missions, WHO, and other institutions that are sort of key drivers of global regulatory agendas. In terms of my interest in psychedelics in this issue, I, like many people, I think, was exposed to the topic at a young age. I read Tom Wolfe's electrocooled acid test when I was like 14 or 15, and became aware of Ken Kesey's participation in the CIA studies at the time, and that led to me learning about some of the other research that was taking place in the 50s and 60s that obviously was then brought to an end. And so I was, and in addition to that, had some experience with a few of these compounds in my 20s. And was kind of primed to notice when news started to emerge a few years ago in various news outlets around much of the research that was going on.
And I'll just say that that's a fairly common trajectory for people I interview. Is we had myself included. We had the rebellious teens and early 20s experimentation phase, and then we started seeing it in the news all of a sudden. We're like, hey, I know about that.
Exactly. Yeah. Although a very different experience.
Very different experience.
An external one as opposed to an inward focused one. So, started following what was happening in the space. I was also interested because, there had been some mental illness in my family, my mother's family, that had quite an impact. And so, was following developments in the space, and at the same time had been following what was happening with cannabis rescheduling, which went to the UN Commission on Narcotic Drugs for a decision in 2020. And a couple of years ago, 18 months, a couple of years ago, I thought, okay, somebody must be doing this with psilocybin or one of the other psychedelic compounds. It just seemed that there was a clear opportunity to advance a case for rescheduling. And while David Nutt and many others had written about the topic, it became clear nobody was actually pursuing an effort. And I thought there was both a need and an opportunity to do so.
Okay. So let's talk about goals. I think it's important to distinguish between legal psilocybin, therapeutically available psilocybin. Rescheduling doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be out there on the market for everyone in the way that cannabis now is here in Canada. So what is ITPRI shooting for?
Yeah,
in terms of access.
Yeah, sure. So the main impetus for my desire to pursue a rescheduling effort along with my co-founder and now our partners and our advisory board members is that the current scheduling under Schedule 1 of the 1971 Convention really adds to the cost, complexity, and duration of conducting research, and in many cases results in research not happening that might otherwise happening. Schedule 1 is totally different than the other three schedules in terms of the obligations it puts on parties to the treaty in terms of implementing domestic controls, and it really is a huge barrier to advancing the science and the development of therapies. The reality is that if we succeed in getting out of Schedule 1, that has no implications on legalization whatsoever. Psilocybin would still remain scheduled internationally, and there would still be obligations that would flow from its then status as a Schedule 2 or 3 drug. Mm-hmm. So it's very much focused on advancing the science and the research through bringing down those barriers.
Mm-hmm. And just to give me an idea, what are the international barriers to psilocybin research outlined in the 1971 convention?
So there's the obligations that state parties are to implement. So basically, it prohibits anything except for Schedule 1 prohibits anything except for very limited scientific and medical use. And then within that bucket of very limited scientific and medical use, licensed or tightly controlled by the government. So you need to get a license every time you want to do research. There's safe custody.
Controlled drugs and substances dealer's license here in Canada.
Yeah, safe custody requirements, limits on the amount that can be used, audits. There's, a number of things that are put in place in terms of domestic regulatory controls that flow from those international obligations that just really gum up the system.
Right. So the restriction or the lifting of restrictions and international obligations wouldn't necessarily loosen those for individual state actors, but it would give them the option under international law.
Exactly. So the idea is that you create a permissive environment, both from a legal and an evidentiary perspective, so that governments that are minded to change those domestic controls, like Canada, maybe, for example, are then able to do so without breaching their international obligations. And we think it also puts pressure on others to take a look. The recent decision out of Australia on potential rescheduling of MDMA and psilocybin, one of the things they look at under the Act in terms of making a decision, whether you need to be in 9 or 8, which are the two most restrictive schedules in Australia, is what is the international status and how's it scheduled? And that's a significant factor that I think likely weighed into their decision not to reschedule MDMA or psilocybin in that recent case.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about process then. How do you actually get the drug rescheduled at the international level and rewrite these conventions and treaties? Who has to say yes to what?
Sure. You don't need to rewrite any conventions or treaties, thankfully. There's a process that's outlined in the treaty and a number of documents that have been adopted by the WHO Executive Board. So there's essentially 2 steps, right? You need to get a review initiated. There's 4 pathways to a review. We'll focus on 3. One is any party to the treaty, any state party to the treaty can initiate a review. One country, that's all it takes. WHO itself can initiate a review, or members of the WHO Expert Committee on Drug Dependence can initiate what's called a pre-review. Now, what's a review? So a review looks at, the Expert Committee on Drug Dependence. It's a body made up of independent experts in science and medicine, addiction, related topics, and they conduct a medical and scientific assessment to look at what is the nature, if any, of the threat to public health in terms of abuse liability, and what's the therapeutic value. So each of the 4 schedules is based on a consideration of those 2 factors. And then they make a recommendation based on their assessment as to whether psilocybin belongs in Schedule 1, looking at those 2 factors. I'll return to that in a second. And then once you get a recommendation out of the WHO, presuming you can, and I'm confident we can get a recommendation for rescheduling if we can get a review initiated. It then goes to the UN Commission on Narcotic Drugs, which is a political body made up of UN member states, and they have to either adopt, reject, or schedule differently than the WHO is recommended. They can't go off and make their own medical and scientific assessment. So they can't say, well, we disagree with the WHO, ECCD on therapeutic usefulness, or we disagree with their findings on the risk to public health. We think, otherwise. They're stuck with that. They can look at legal, administrative, other factors, in making their decision. And then it's potentially subject to a review by the UN Economic and Social Council if any member state objects to the decision of the CND. Very simple.
Yeah, very, very straightforward. Thank you.
Not very simple.
I thought we had a complicated thing going on just here in Canada, but got another thing coming here.
Absolutely. I mean, just one thing to add, in terms of the case for moving psilocybin out of Schedule 1. Schedule 1 is only meant for drugs that present an especially serious risk to public health in terms of their abuse liability and have very little, if any, therapeutic value.
Right. And we can present a strong case that psilocybin does not fit that category.
Doesn't tick either box, let alone both of them, which is really what's required to be in Schedule 1.
Okay. So where are you at with this functionally? How functional is the organization ITPRI at the moment, and in what stage of this process? I mean, you did, I think just there, you did a good job of simplifying the whole process, even though it doesn't seem that simple to me. But where do you actually begin? What steps are you at? Who do you have to approach?
I have a full-time job. This is unpaid work on my part. Unfortunately, I've spent much of my time on this effort over the last 12 to 18 months, getting an entity established, bringing in partners, establishing a board of directors and an advisory board. We have an excellent advisory board and fantastic partners. Getting the thing launched so that we can get word out there amongst various stakeholders that we're pursuing this effort.
Well, we're happy to help.
Yeah, and I appreciate it. And so the current focus is twofold, really: is fundraising to support our efforts, and then to start now initiating engagements with governments that will be targeting on the state party initiated review side, as well as engaging with the WHO, the Expert Committee on Drug Dependence, and a number of other international institutions, like the Office of the Human Rights Commissioner, for example, UN Development Office, so on and so forth. So there's a bunch of international institutions that could help or hinder our efforts that we need to engage with as well. So
you're working the mailing list at this point.
Yeah, I mean, the great thing is I'm 2.5 hours, 3 hours away from Geneva, depending on traffic, and have lots of experience engaging with folks in Geneva on various issues. So we'll be looking to meet with folks at the permanent missions as a starting point, build some support amongst those diplomats who have responsibility for WHO files, and then move back to capital once we've got the sort of local experts engaged in building champions for the effort. Yeah.
So laying some groundwork locally in Geneva. Okay.
Yeah.
And tell me about these other partners and various stakeholders in ITPRI that you brought in. There's definitely some names I recognize in there.
Sure, absolutely. We've got, in no particular order, MAPS, the Beckley Foundation, Mind Medicine Australia, the Osmond Foundation, which is based out of Sweden, the Open Foundation based out of the Netherlands, Nierica, which is based out of Mexico, and I hope I'm not forgetting somebody. I think that's it. There's six. So there's six initial partners. And then, as I mentioned, we pulled together a terrific advisory board, which includes Joost Brexema, who's the founder of the Open Foundation, Rick Doblin's on our advisory board, as is Amanda Fielding. I won't go through the whole list. We've got Joe Neal, who's a professor of psychopharmacology, excuse me, from the University of Manchester, and she chairs. Drug Science is our other partner, sorry.
Yep.
And she chairs Drug Science's Medical Psychedelics Working Group. And then we've got a couple real subject matter experts, a gentleman by the name of Wilhelm Scholten, who was the secretary to the Expert Committee on Drug Dependence and played a pivotal role in advancing the cannabis review and recommendation through the WHO. And a gentleman by the name of Jan van Amsterdam, who has written for the WHO a number of critical review documents. So basically the the base working document that the expert committee on drug dependence.
Right. So people who have done this before for cannabis are going to be writing these documents for
cannabis and other topics. Yeah. For other compounds, they were not scheduled and being scheduled. Yeah. So some real inside expertise that will help fill the gaps where my knowledge may be lacking in what is actually a very complicated and detailed process.
Yeah. Particularly with all of the research that's looking to get done.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. And obviously engaging the scientific community to bring in the evidence base that we'll need to support our efforts.
Okay, so I understand that ITPRI has set up a list of sort of priority target countries that you want to approach to initiate this review. I'd like to know a bit about why, these countries in particular, and why the United States was excluded. We had some feedback about that from our readership too.
Yeah, and I just saw a comment on LinkedIn from somebody who had noticed one of the articles and noting that the U.S. was not included. And I don't think it was a criticism. I think it was sort of flagging the sad state of affairs to the audience. So we looked at a number of factors. So one has been various governments' approach to harm reduction and drug policy reform. What has been their approach to instituting medicinal cannabis regimes? What is their approach to the funding and availability of mental health services? And lastly, to what degree, if any, is there ongoing research in a particular country on psychedelics? And not all the countries we're targeting tick all those boxes, but they tick one or more, in some cases, several. And so that's sort of how we've come up with our target list. The United States, I just don't think is going to lead on this issue. I think there's some great work being done by a number of organizations there to influence legislative change and rescheduling on psilocybin and other compounds. And I hope those efforts are successful. But given the United States' traditional role in the war on drugs and the complexity around drug policy, I just don't see them
involving them might be counterproductive at this point.
Getting involved at an early stage. They would be involved later because every member state is sent a questionnaire on any scheduling issue and asked for input. But they're not going to put up their hand and say, this needs to be done.
Well, currently it's a patchwork of statewide decriminalization and legalization and study and various initiatives along with public and private sector research going on. So there doesn't seem to be an overarching approach there.
Absolutely. And it may be that psilocybin is rescheduled in the US within the next several years if there's a FDA approval for a particular indication.
And that could realistically happen. We're looking at a lot of phase 2 trials there beginning this year. So, I'm not gonna say never. I'm sure you guys aren't either, but
absolutely.
It makes sense to me. And any expected kind of response from these priority governments? Are you particularly optimistic about any of them? Being a Canadian, how do you feel Health Canada will be?
Yeah. I mean, I think Canada is certainly at or near the top of our list. Obviously, some recent changes in terms of special access and a lot of work being done by various organizations in Canada to advance efforts around this. I think Canada, few things. Significant funding from the Trudeau government for mental health services. He's got personal familiarity with mental health issues in his own family. It's a big priority for his wife in terms of the work that she does. And Canada has led on some important drug policy issues, including medicinal cannabis. And so I think this may be a very attractive option to the Canadian government. In a sense, it allows them to throw the issue to the WHO and the CND and avoid some of the potentially messy politics of just acting domestically in a way that would breach their violations again under international law, because that's what they've done, obviously, with cannabis legalization. They may not want to go to that well too many times.
I mean, I think my impression from the psychedelics and drug policy reporting side is that they are being pretty cautious. And while there's, special access is a very important step, but it's not a blanket decriminalization step by any means. It's a review process for individuals that will, hopefully for the patient's sake, to my mind, be a bit more expedited than the Section 56 exemption process that already existed. But even in terms of the local harm reduction efforts in places like Vancouver and my own home city of Toronto, the current process is going to be looks like it's going to be Section 56 exemptions for cities, which also seems like a fairly cautious move to me. But I would welcome your perspective from an international drug policy expert.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I'm not surprised that they're being cautious, right? While there's growing public support for making psychedelic therapies available to patients, and I think that's the case in Canada, and growing awareness, these are still delicate political issues. You've got a minority government there, and I don't know what the views of the opposition are on this, but they could be open to criticism from the opposition party or others. If they move too quickly on a substance that probably many parents of teenagers and younger adults are concerned about still, through a lack of awareness around abuse liability issues and whatnot. And the reality is that these are powerful drugs, right? And we should all be proceeding with caution when it comes to how these drugs are deployed in terms of servicing important patient needs.
All right. Well, I think that's just about all the questions I had for you. Just close by asking you what the next steps are for ITPRI, and we talked a bit about this already. But do you have a prospective timeline for when we might see some of these major actors approach, a review initiated? What are your hopes?
Yeah, I mean, we'll start engaging ASAP. In terms of a review being initiated, I think that within 12 to 18 months of us starting engagement, we'll have a pretty good sense whether we have identified champions within governments or the WHO or the Expert Committee on Drug Dependence who will help move the ball forward on this. And I think if in 18 months' time we're not making any progress, we need to rethink our strategy and our targets and who we're talking to and how we're presenting our case. And then, it may then take a bit more time to actually get a review initiated. It's not a quick process. It's not cannabis. It's not going to be 9 years. That was a very strange process for cannabis. But we're looking at a multi-year process to achieve this if we can be successful.
All right. Well, I think that's everything from us. Thank you, everyone, for tuning into this week's episode of Truffle Talks. Once again, I'm James Stephen, the editor of Truffle Report, and this has been Chris Koddermann for ITPRI. You can find us online at truffle.report or as Truffle Report on Facebook, YouTube, TikTok, and LinkedIn, and Truffle_report on Twitter, Instagram, and Reddit. And finally, for any of you who enjoy the sound of my voice but can't stand my face, all of our Truffle Talks episodes are now available in audio-only format on Spotify. See you next week.